The president is now back to the business of being president, presenting a new budget proposal to Congress, which they'll be arguing over next week. And the mainstream headlines are screaming that the Trump budget calls for massive cuts to welfare and Medicare to fund his new Space Force. But what's really in the budget? Joining us now is Romina Boccia, a leading fiscal and economic expert at the Heritage Foundation, and she focuses on government spending and the national debt. Romina, thanks for joining us today. So there's a lot in his budget proposal. Can you go over a little bit about what's in there, and is it really cutting everything that the Democrats are saying it's cutting?
The president's budget proposal looks actually very similar to his previous three budget proposals. There are a couple new areas of priorities in there, but overall, the president's budget would balance over the course of 15 years. And in terms of where the spending reductions take place, there's a 5% reduction in non-defense domestic programs. That was a staple in his previous budget, so there's nothing new there. Congress has consistently ignored those proposals. And then there are some reforms in Medicare and Medicaid, many of which are actually good governance reforms to ensure that benefits are targeting the most vulnerable beneficiaries when it comes to Medicaid, making sure that only those eligible are getting benefits. And in Medicare, there's been a lot of misinformation because there are no benefit cuts. Instead, what the president does is fix some of the underlying payment issues, how hospitals and doctors get reimbursed, for example, to find savings in Medicare that will improve choices for seniors and actually lower their out-of-pocket costs. So, and many of those proposals, which is what Democrats haven't been very frank about, were included in President Obama's budgets and have been championed by leading Democrats. So these are very common sense, good governance reforms that if we weren't in an election year, we should see both parties embrace and work together to enact.
Romina, there is a criticism, though, that the president is assuming 3% growth in the GDP, which hasn't happened for years. And that will be a determining factor in him paying down the debt. It's at $1 trillion, well, $22 trillion as a debt and $1 trillion deficit kind of for the next few years. What's more realistic, and what would be the implication of a more realistic outlook?
So we have to consider the fact that the president's economic growth assumptions are built on the idea that the president's agenda would be enacted. And I think this is where these assumptions are optimistic, because Congress has already declared the budget dead on arrival. The House Budget Committee chairman, who's supposed to be in charge of leading the budget process in Congress, has said it's highly unlikely that Congress will even pursue a budget this year. It's an election year. They don't want to do tough work. They don't want to make trade-offs. And preferably, they don't want to tell the American people what their agenda would actually cost. I think that's deeply troubling. But 3% growth assumptions, if all of the policies in the president's budget were enacted, I don't think are that unrealistic. They might be optimistic, but the president is a very optimistic man. And who would have thought that we would have gotten unemployment down to 3.5%? That is just unbelievable. This economy is so strong that I'm not surprised to see the president betting on yet more growth if his agenda were enacted.
Well, Romina, what about tax cuts? Are there tax cuts in this proposed budget?
So the president's budget would extend the individual tax cuts from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Those are the tax cuts that 9 out of 10 Americans were benefiting from in 2018 and 2019. A family of 4 saw an average tax burden reduction of roughly $3,000. So those are the tax cuts the president's budget would extend. The one area where they forgot or failed to extend good tax policy is when it comes to expensing. That's a policy that allows businesses to write off the cost of investments immediately. And what that does is it encourages more investment, which then increases productivity, which boosts wages for workers. So I hope the administration will take another look at expensing and make that part of their agenda for Tax Cuts 2.0.
Romina, how come conservatives complain so much about the deficit when there's a Democrat in the White House, but not when a Republican is?
Well, I call myself a conservative, and I do complain about the deficit, regardless of which party is in power. Our deficits are driven by higher spending. You just need to look at the facts. So from 2018 to 2019, tax revenue actually went up by 4%, despite the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or maybe perhaps because of it, because it's boosting the economy. Meanwhile, spending went up at twice the rate at 8%. So we actually have higher tax revenues chasing much, much higher spending. And that's what's driving our deficits and debt. And higher spending is a bipartisan problem. You've seen the president cut deals with Nancy Pelosi in order to increase defense spending. He's agreed to steep increases in non-defense domestic programs, which is why, again, some analysts are saying the president's budget assumptions are unrealistic because he signed these deals before. And that's what's driving our deficits and debt higher, as well as programs that were enacted long before President Trump took office.
Okay.